Welcome to the Samueletini Show, where business, innovation and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in. Welcome to a new episode. And today on the show, we are going, I think, back home with somebody here dear to our hearts, a Kenyan, now in the diaspora, who is working at the forefront of AI, education, and really fostering the concept of Ubuntu. We want to discuss with her and we will learn everything about it. So I'm very pleased to welcome here today Wakanyi Macharia-Hoffman. Wakanyi, it's such a pleasure having you today here.
Such a pleasure to be with you as well. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
And Wakanyi, you are researching in AI, fostering education, also working on folktale, really bringing the indigenous knowledge. But before all of that, we want to know a bit about you. Who is Wakanyi?
Wakanyi is a product of the village. So we say in Africa, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, I am that child that came out of a village in Kenya, and I feel it's such a privilege today to even say that, because there's a lot of problems with parenting, with education for our children, and uncertainty about what the future looks like for children. And for me, I grew up in this wonderful environment. Of course, as every environment has its own problems, but for me, I focused on the joy of living a very wild-eyed childhood. I was a child of the wilderness, And for that essentially means that there was very little regulations towards my existence, physical. My body was not a data point for anyone, My thinking was not anyone's business. How I moved in the world was not anybody's business. So I was just a carefree child, like every other child around me. So I grew up in a time in post-colonial Kenya, outside of Nairobi, on the outskirts of Nairobi, close to Ngong Forest. And there was my primary school was inside the forest. So for me, growing up was close to nature, was not theoretical or something to even look for. We were basically inside the forest, And so that's my upbringing. And then I studied journalism and I wanted to become a reporter. So I did actually become one. I worked for the Daily Nation for a few months. And then I left and worked for a small magazine. Then I went back to the mainstream media and worked for the Standard. So I've moved around in that media space. So I understand a bit about how the storytelling industry has evolved in Africa. And then after that, I became a mom and we started moving around. My husband used to work for the UN, so we moved a lot because of his job. But I always took my writing with me and I started writing children's books. And that's where really my interest in African indigenous knowledge became conscious, is when I became a mom. And I realized that how I had grown up with this very deep knowledge of what it means to be human in nature, with everything around you. It was not a theory. It was not something you had to be taught. It was already in practice. And I knew that my kids were not going to have that kind of experience. So writing these stories was a way of recovering that knowledge, at least to start seeding the ideas of what true interconnectedness looks like or feels like with the stories. And then when we come to Kenya, when I take my kids to Kenya, they can see it in action through the way that people live.
Fantastic. And it's really a wonderful journey, from the start, the Ngong Forest, and we know now with urbanization, everything has changed a lot now, also in Nairobi. And then also your work in the indigenous collection, folklore, and the stories. And now I think you have moved in, let's say, the hot, topic of the planet, that is AI and Ubuntu. So maybe for the people they don't know much about it, can you explain a bit what is Ubuntu? How this concept, how you translate it in practice?
So Ubuntu is a Bantu word. It emerged out of South African communities, particularly the Zulu, the Shona. It's a Nguni word, and it means being human. And it's usually captured in this saying, well, for most people, probably they have heard the saying, I am because of who we are. But there's another way of translating Ubuntu, which is also in my mother tongue. And in Shona language, they say, Umuntu, Gubuntu, Gabantu. In my language, I say, Moduneado, which means a person is a person through other persons. So Ubuntu is relational intelligence. It's about who I am in relation to myself and who I am in relation to us. So from me to we, and then who are we in relation to our environment or our habitat. So it is a process of understanding who I am as myself, as an individual being with my own unique thoughts and experiences or ideas, and then who I am in the context of the collective as ourselves when we become one mind or one heart or one people. And then who are we in relation to everything else that is alive in the world? So that's Ubuntu in a nutshell, how I understand it. And I use this concept of Ubuntu to talk about what it means to be truly human. To be truly human is not an idea about isolation or individualism. There is a personalized way of being. Of course, you have your own quirkiness, you have your own interests, desires, likes and dislikes. All of that is part of self-discovery, self-examining yourself, right? However, from an Ubuntu perspective, it doesn't end there. Your life is in relation to everything else that's around you. So that's real Ubuntu, is understanding myself to understand how I am with others and how I'm seen by others and seeing myself as the other as well. So it's reciprocity. It's a continuous refinement of who I am, who we are, who we all are in relation to the earth. And I use that concept to respond to this very urgent question right now in the world, where I'm in different spaces, like with philosophers, with academics of all kinds, with technologists, with investors, with entrepreneurs. And the question in the room, the big elephant in the room, even with indigenous leaders around the world, is what kind of human being are we becoming in the face of this artificial intelligence? We built something, or something has been built. Not everyone has built it. Something has been invented that we now are aware of. It has been going on for a while. It's not new, artificial intelligence, right? Now it is there, and everybody, a lot of people understand what AI is. But it is a mirror of what we mean when we say that we are human. This is our reflection of our knowledge, our ideas, our way of being together. Now, we can talk about the bias, we can talk about how it's not inclusive of everyone's cultures. But as it stands, AI is designed to represent humanity. It's a human idea. So is that who we are? So my question, to respond to that, I say, can we think about ourselves from a perspective of Ubuntu? Who am I in relation to you? Who are we in relation to each other? And who are we in relation to the planet? And that's true Ubuntu. And I want to really seed this idea in people's minds when they're using AI, to really be ethical about it, to really be mindful about how they are prompting AI. What kind of questions are you holding in yourself that you put out there into the system, and then the system responds based on the data it's been trained on, which is not necessarily everybody's data in the world. So can we think about what that means even? We're shaping a new intelligence that is supposed to represent us. And for that to happen, we need to ask ourselves, who are we really? And that question, who am I? What does it mean to be human? Was answered thousands of years ago by our ancestors all across Africa when they came up with the word Ubuntu, or in Kikuyu we say umundu, which means being human.
And this is, I mean, it's a very interesting point, because I see also, AI and the war now is also creating a sort of standardization. I think a lack also of imagination, a lack also of differentiation, putting together a system. We can see it from production things or others that more or less they are there. And how I want to ask, I mean, having in mind this concept, that is really humanity, let's say an holistic concept. I would say I see myself, I see the other, I see also the relation with the ecosystem, I see the relation with other people. I can also see outside myself and see the other. How you can design, a system, AI system, also working in your research with ethic, that are really inclusive, but also responsive to what the diversity and the multifacets of the human, let's say, race and human perspective.
Well, to begin with, I think we're all building this technology, whether we opt in or out. There is no option to opt in and out. So in some way or the other, we're already doing it, So there is already a solution to that. But more technically speaking, I don't have a computer science background and I'm not a data scientist, but I do talk to people who have that technical knowledge. And there has been, for example, there's an Ubuntu optimization algorithm called ulimi. And this ulimi emerged out of the University of Johannesburg, was designed by computer scientists there. I can send you, it's a paper, and also it has the algorithm. And it literally details how to design an algorithm that optimizes for cooperation and collaboration so that agents, AI agents, we're getting into that agentic AI space. As it stands right now, they are not trained in Ubuntu. They're not trained to collaborate. They're trained to compete. If you look at video games, how kids play, it's all about competition. It's all about beating your opponent. It's nothing about coming together and seeing each other as the other. So with this Ulimisana algorithm, it actually flips that narrative and centers unity at the heart of it. So it even uses African proverbs, African stories, and African indigenous ways of seeing ourselves as humanity, who we are. And Ulimisana is about coming together. That's what the algorithm is about. So it is possible to design an AI system that is optimized for Ubuntu. And I think that's how then we promote the Ubuntu way within the AI systems. But for me, I'm coming from not even so much interested in the AI system itself, but more interested in the human beings in the loop. All of us we're involved in this process. So the question I come with to designers, to investors, entrepreneurs, anyone that is involved in this business, the question I ask is, who are you? What kind of human are you? What does it mean to be human to you? And therefore, then I'm seeding this question in their minds to provoke you to start thinking about what does it mean to be human? And if what I'm designing is going to affect all of humanity, which affects me from an Ubuntu perspective, then I am accountable to co-creating an environment in which either I flourish or we don't flourish, right? So thinking about flourishing from my own perspective is also from an Ubuntu perspective. I am thinking about flourishing of the whole world. If I'm thinking about myself, there is no self, atomized, isolated self from an Ubuntu perspective. But it's also true in science, right? There's nothing that is isolated. So that cooperation, co-creation, collaboration is what I'm promoting within this space of AI by bringing in the Ubuntu way of seeing each other. And the ethics of that then can help with the design thinking so that we can create better technology.
And it's a really interesting, perspective. And when you are talking, I was thinking, this is also calls for a paradigm shift on how also our education, our people, our programmers, our leaders, are also trained and wired. We are all wired for competition, for individualism, to see the ecosystem as an externality. Now Ubuntu calls for a different paradigm shift. So just say in a different way. And we know that the older you get, the less easier, is to change. So I think the start is always with the younger generation, how you can foster this and a big role of education in this part. So, and also the use of this technology, even to foster mothers and kids, they look in this perspective. So since you are also involved in the education space and other, how you shape the education space, putting, really the principles of Ubuntu in that area.
Yeah, thank you for that. And what I have done is a few years ago, 5 years ago, I started this project, formally started it, but it was always there, the African Folktales Project. And really this project began almost 20 years ago when I had my first child. She's now almost 20. And, when you become a mom, when you become a parent, you start to see the world very differently, right? And suddenly I was faced with this child who her world was very different to the world that I grew up in. And particularly when she started school and we started reading children's books, I would notice that I was doing the same thing as everyone else, just picking the most popular children's books and just reading those to her. And suddenly I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, what about my stories? What about the stories that I grew up in? How are those? When will she ever be exposed to the stories of my people? So I started to collect my folk tales, and then I would tell them to my kids. Now I have 4 kids. So I would keep telling them all these stories. And we even produced a little podcast for the African Folktales Project. So what that was for me was a conscious effort and a decision to start wisdom keeping, to start curating African indigenous knowledge. Because what has happened, and we can see it now, it's even clear, we don't have real storytellers in the village anymore. And even if they are there, we don't have the kids interacting with the elderly anymore in the way that at least I interacted with them. So we stand to lose this knowledge. We say if an elderly person dies in Africa, we say it's like a library has burned down, right? So we've got these libraries burning down everywhere. My mom is one of the last generations of people who even speak the mother tongues. So there is that problem as well. With the language lost, then we lose the stories. When we lose the stories, we lose the knowledge. So I decided to recover those stories for my kids. And then it became a fully fledged project. And now it's a curriculum. In fact, today we're going to be gathering on the Ubuntu Education Hub to co-create the curriculum of the African Folktales Project. And what that means is I'm not replacing the education system that exists in the schools. We can continue down the path of the British education system or the French education system or whatever. But what I am saying is there is a puzzle missing. For me, all knowledge is essential to our being here. So I cannot hold one knowledge system higher than the other. And therefore I cannot demote one and raise the other. But I think that it is a tragedy that we don't have indigenous knowledge inside the classroom where the children are, and yet the kids don't have access to the grandmothers and grandfathers who have all this knowledge. So this gap is what I'm trying to collapse by bringing the indigenous knowledge in school. And what a better way to do it than through stories that then kids can obviously relate to and understand. And the teachers then can pull out of the stories the lesson plan that suits the class that the subject that they want to teach. So it's a very straightforward solution. Bring the stories to the classroom, and the teachers become wisdom weavers even, or indigenous knowledge weavers. So they weave that knowledge into the classroom. So as you're teaching a STEM subject, you might have a story, an African folktale, that actually complements what the kids are learning. And then you're inviting people to also recover their languages, because some of these stories are even better told in the original language. So I'm also empowering the teachers to just speak the language that they would naturally speak. And that creates a new way of relating. So it's about relationships that I'm building here.
And it's such an interesting part, because we have seen with the standardization, I mean, maybe sometimes even Americanization of the word. So more or less every area has become following that model. So it's such an interesting part. And I want to know a bit more, about this curriculum. How do you want also, or have you already also systems in school that have practice and practical example of this as work? And really also the feedback and the impact that you had.
I've had nothing but great feedback. It is almost like a breath of fresh air. There are so many people hungry for this knowledge. There are parents in African parents in the diaspora, parents on the continent. This is an actual huge gap in the education system. There was a big rush to teaching STEM subjects, and then we moved into STEAM, and then we're still there. We haven't quite decided how we want to transform education in Africa, because we haven't decided what to do with African knowledge, African indigenous knowledge systems. So the feedback I get is, we want more of this. What can we do with this? How can we bring it into more classrooms? I actually teach teachers how to use the African Folktales Project curriculum, teachers outside of the continent. And then, of course, like I said, I'm partnered with the Ubuntu Education Hub. And there we have more than 21,000 teachers that are subscribed on this platform that now have access to the African Folktales curriculum. And that is a huge relief for teachers. So actually, if I may, I would like to invite anyone that is an educator, school administrator, ministries of education, anyone that's involved in education, to come into the hub and join us, because we're doing something really magical. It's a very grassroots thing, but at the same time, the teachers are already using the folktales. They're inspired to go into the classroom and use them with the kids.
And I can see the power, no, of those stories And also because having kids here in Kenya, the discussion and what we have, they are really also magical, these stories, and also how to bring back, no, also the indigenous knowledge. So I want to ask how you have, can you integrate, some this of the indigenous knowledge in formal curricula? Is it possible, to have a win-win situation there?
Absolutely. Like I said, for example, there's a story about one folktale. It's the story of the first rainbow. This is a story that I recovered from Zambia, Botswana, actually. It was a Botswana folktale, or rather, that's where it was told. So that story completely ties to a science lesson, a lesson about chemical components of rain, even. So you can see how easy it is for children to pick up a scientific concept when they have a story that is relatable and a story that has characters and names of children that sound familiar, and the environment also looks familiar. And another thing is the African Folktales Project, the way that I brought it into a formal space was actually to tie the stories to the Sustainable Development Goals. So what I did was, out of all the stories that I had, I picked 17 folktales, very well curated, to respond to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the podcast, the Folktale Fridays, is actually 17 folktales for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And each story has a lesson for the sustainability issue for each goal. So you can imagine bringing that to the classroom. You're directly showing children that we have the solutions, local solutions to Sustainable Development Goals problems. All these global challenges, the solutions are local. So it's about localizing our knowledge, but also finding the solutions locally before you can go out there thinking that the solutions are elsewhere. They're right there. And these stories are not fairy tales. They're actually lessons encoded in a story that is easy to understand for children. But they're quite deeply rich in the knowledge that they carry. And that's what I'm bringing into the classroom.
And it's really interesting, as all for traditional knowledge, as having, I like this, I've also been a bit in the education space. It's something that can relate also the person with the culture and also help. When you were talking, I read some of the stories you've done and others, African, they can help also people now in the urbanized areas. I know people in Nairobi, they're more Kenyan than me. They have never seen, never connected with any farm animals or even wild animals because they live in the concrete jungle. So that also helps restoring, that knowledge, and also help also in the conservation of the heritage and the world, because it's really see how also the ancestors were living and which are the answers that they were given, to some of these things. How do you see the future for this? Can be something that, when you said, I like this, finding local solution, even in my work in the at NGO, we try also to discuss with farmers and see what is locally practicable. We have fostered a local organization because we live in localization. Funny enough, many development projects, or even when we discuss with governments, it's true, we need to benchmark. You have heard this. We have to go to funny places around the world to get a solution, and then trying to copy paste. So, how do you see this movement? And do you think that this could be also picking up? How do you see the future for this movement? And do you see that now is picking up the diaspora and other picking up this and una renaissance of this traditional knowledge?
So as with the traditional way of passing down knowledge, it's a slow journey, right? It is seeding. All I'm doing is planting the seeds in the classrooms with the teachers, and then the teachers plant the seeds with the kids. So I cannot see far out, but all I know is that the children who receive this level of education will always have an advantage in terms of their possibilities of finding solutions, because they're already neurologically connecting different neurons, right? They're seeing the world very differently, not just this one linear way of looking at solution and impact and one solution. Like, for example, right now, AI is going to solve everything. No, it's not this general purpose tool that will solve every single problem that we have. It will solve some problems, but a lot of the problems that we have are relational. And Ubuntu, this concept, is all about repairing the relationships between human beings and human beings and the world, that the environment that we live in. And our stories, these folk tales, always come back around to repairing that relationship. Every single story that I read, if I could say if there was something in common across all the stories, it is always repairing the relationship between you and yourself, you and others, you and the animals, and then you and the world, or all of us and the planet. So this is a very different way of thinking about your place in the world. And if you grow up with this kind of information, then you're looking at the world very differently. You would not even think about cutting down a tree without considering how that tree affects the ecosystem around you. But if you're growing up in an apartment building, and even if you're growing up in an apartment building, if you have this information, at least you know. But imagine without it, and now you're cut off from the knowledge. You're also cut off from the land. I say this all the time now, that this is a crisis where we have children growing up in high-rise buildings. They're no different to the kids growing up in the slums in Africa, because they have the same shared problem. They have no access to the real land. And so to me, I feel like that is the answer to that, is to bring the knowledge to them where they are. Follow the kids where they're going, and then they'll be wanting to come back home to the village.
It's something that more and more, we have the problem that now the urban migration, everybody wants to go to Nairobi or even to the big town, but also how we can bring them back to the village to rediscover that everything and the roots and the connection from the language, the discussion, and also the way also to preserve, because the city cannot live without the land and the environment behind it and the knowledge behind it. And really, I want to ask, you mentioned also, we can go back a bit to the AI and things, how we can shape the world, how we can really use AI also to shape this type of future, especially for educators and other, how can be shaped, and all for parents that really wants to give this open perspective that we really need in the modern world that is built around fortresses, and then we want to have a common relation, a common understanding that will help also heal not only the relationship us and the environment, maybe between humans in general.
Well, we know that now we know enough about AI. We know that AI is only as good as the intelligence that we've fed it with. So the big question for me, before I look at the product AI, and when we talk about AI, we can define it as many things. But if we just talk about what we're looking at, is our relationships are the ones that are defining this intelligence. And so for me, I think AI is a good metaphor for who are we as human beings. Is that who we really are? And so we are all responsible for what this technology becomes, how it emerges, what it represents. We're all responsible for that. And I like what you said earlier on, that it's become this thing that flattens the experience of humanity. But now here we are. The question is, what does it mean to be human? And we can look at the output that we're getting from AI, the kinds of tools that we are producing with AI systems. Are those the tools that are going to help us repair these relationships, human to human relationships? So even before we look at the technology itself, we must look at ourselves inside. We must start to look and consider who we are on the inside. So I think AI is a good technology for a mirror of helping us take a little pause and ask ourselves, what have we become, or what are we becoming? And is that who we are really becoming? And then once we have that response, it is a kind of a consciousness level of rising, where we then can start to see each other in that Ubuntu way. We can start to see how we coexist, or maybe we don't coexist. We can start to see what are the relationships around me that I actually need to repair in order to live well, because no one is isolated. No one is living in a bubble. AI has revealed all the good and the bad and the ugly sides of society, right? So can we now start to challenge that, whether that's who we are? But we can only do that if we take the responsibility to take the decision to actually look at yourself fully, examine yourself fully, and examine yourself through others as well. And that's true Ubuntu. is really mirroring of who we are becoming together.
And that is such a powerful lesson because, as you said, I mean, we need to build systems that really help, us also restore and recreate this sort of relationship. And I think also going back to the roots, and especially for our continent, going back to the indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, not just in veneration, but also helping it, helping us to use it also in a forward way, not just a sort of nostalgia or past, but using it for planning in the future. That I think it will be an important step forward. So, if you have a final maybe recommendation or people for people they want to know a bit more about your work and your project, what will tell them?
Well, I want to invite everyone to the Ubuntu Education Hub. Please come along and come with a story. Come with any story that you can remember from the continent, from your grandmothers, from anybody that ever gave you a story. Bring it and let's unpack it. Let's see what are the lessons in these stories that we've been carrying with us in our minds. And then I also invite you to check out the African Folktales Project.com. It's a brand new website, recently relaunched in Davos. So I'm really excited. And it tells you a lot about my journey and what actually I'm trying to do. And so if there's any way you want to come along, partner, support, we can do that. And then lastly, I am the co-director of the Inclusive AI Lab, which is based here in the Netherlands at Utrecht University. And this lab, we are really changing that narrative of AI. We are less concerned about the utopian, dystopian, doom and gloom scenario. And we're sat in the middle. And we're asking ourselves, what does it mean to be human? Who are the people who are being left out? What is AI reflecting back? And how can we ensure that nobody is left behind and that everyone who has a good idea about what it means to be human can be able to use this technology, to shape this technology in the right direction? So we're really challenging public participation and less interested in worrying about AI taking over our jobs or destroying humanity. That's what we want.
And that is a good way forward. Respect the negativism or the hyper optimism. A good middle ground also focusing on the human factor. That is, I think, the most important aspect that sometimes is often overlooked. So, it's been an honor and pleasure having you, Wakanyi. It's been great having you on the show. Asante sana.
Asante sana, Samuele. Thank you.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.